All right, so today we are going to really dig into this complex story about the Adani Group and the allegations that have been rocking it. We've got news articles, we've got financial reports, we've got political commentary, and we're going to break it all down so you know what's going on, even if you haven't been following this super closely.
What we're seeing here is something that has huge implications. This touches international finance, renewable energy, political power, really playing out on a global stage.
Exactly. This case really has it all. You've got these accusations of high-level corruption, this huge market crash, political firestorms in India, and now potential legal battles that could stretch across continents. To help us kind of make sense of all this, I'm joined by our expert who is really good at, connecting the dots and seeing the bigger picture, especially in really complex situations like this one. So let's just start by setting the stage. Who is Gautam Adani and what is the Adani Group?
The Adani Group is one of India's most powerful business conglomerates, and they're involved in a huge range of industries. Ports, energy, infrastructure, mining, you name it. Up until very recently, Gautam Adani was the third richest person in the world, so that kind of gives you a sense of the scale and the influence of his empire.
Yeah, and that kind of wealth and power, it doesn't come easily. And it also means that these allegations against Adani have the potential to really send shockwaves through the global economy.
Absolutely. These allegations of bribery have really shaken investor confidence, and they've raised these serious questions about the Adani Group's business practices. I think what's grabbing headlines is really the sheer scale of this alleged scheme. We're talking about over $265 million in bribes allegedly paid to secure solar energy contracts from Indian government officials.
Wow. $265 million? That is a staggering sum. What exactly are the specific charges that Adani is facing?
So, a U.S. indictment has been unsealed, and it's charging Adani and 7 others with conspiracy to commit securities fraud, wire fraud, and bribery under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And that is this really powerful legal tool that the U.S. government uses to prosecute companies and individuals for bribing foreign officials, even if those bribes occurred outside of the U.S.
So even though these alleged bribes happened in India, the U.S. government is stepping in because it involves U.S. markets and investors.
I see. What kind of penalties could Adani be facing if he's convicted?
Well, these charges carry some pretty serious consequences, including hefty fines that could reach hundreds of millions of dollars, and even the possibility of prison time.
Okay, so let's dig into the details of the alleged scheme itself. How did this bribery scheme allegedly work? What specific actions did Adani allegedly take?
So according to the indictment, between 2021 and 2023, Adani and his associates allegedly paid bribes to officials in several Indian states, including Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and Odisha.
And the goal of these bribes was to secure contracts with a pretty key player in India's renewable energy sector. That's right. The contracts were with the Solar Energy Corporation of India, SCCI for short. And they're responsible for promoting and developing solar power projects in the country. The indictment alleges that Adani targeted SCCI because they were having trouble finding buyers for the high-priced solar power being produced by companies like Adani Green Energy and Azure Power. So there may have been a sense of urgency on Adani's part to secure these contracts and keep those revenues flowing.
I see. So allegedly these bribes were a way for Adani to guarantee those lucrative contracts with SCCI. But how exactly did they pull it off? Who were they allegedly bribing, and how did that help them manipulate the system?
So they allegedly targeted specific officials within the state electricity distribution companies, or DISCOMs. And these DISCOMs are responsible for buying and distributing electricity to consumers within their respective states. So by bribing these officials, Adani could allegedly manipulate the process of signing power sale agreements, or PSAs, with SCCI. And this would essentially lock in those contracts for Adani's solar projects, even if his bids weren't the most competitive.
This sounds like a complex scheme with a lot of moving parts. It's fascinating how these alleged bribes could have really rippled through the system, impacting not just SCCI, but also the DISCOMs and ultimately electricity consumers in India.
You've hit on a crucial point there, the potential impact on the actual electricity consumers. One of the allegations is that these bribes could have contributed to the rising power tariffs in those states where this alleged bribery was taking place. So you don't just have this legal fallout for Adani, but you also have the possibility of economic consequences for ordinary Indians.
Right. This isn't just a story about corporate greed and political maneuvering. This is a story that could have a very direct impact on people's lives. But before we go too far down that road, let's get back to the more immediate consequences of the indictment. We know about the stock market crash. What was the Adani Group's initial response to these accusations?
Well, they issued some strong denials, calling the charges baseless. And they really tried to emphasize their commitment to good governance. They also pointed to the fact that these states, where this alleged bribery took place, were governed by opposition parties at the time. It seems like they were trying to distance themselves from any political connections.
That does sound like a pretty classic corporate response.
Yeah.
Deny, deflect, and try to control the narrative. But their actions speak louder than words, right?
Mm-hmm.
What concrete steps did they take in the wake of the indictment?
So one very significant move was their decision to actually withdraw a $600 million bond offering in the U.S. And I think this really suggests that they're feeling the heat from investors and are concerned about their ability to raise capital in this current climate.
Yeah, that is a huge financial hit. It shows that the market is taking these allegations very seriously. You mentioned the Adani Group trying to kind of distance themselves politically. What's been the reaction from the Indian government, specifically from Prime Minister Modi and the ruling BJP party?
So the BJP has been really emphasizing the presumption of innocence, arguing that Adani deserves a fair trial before any judgments are made. And again, they've also been pointing to the fact that these states involved were under opposition control, suggesting that any corruption was localized and not really a sign of this systemic problem.
So they're really trying to contain the damage and prevent the scandal from becoming a broader indictment of their governance. But what about the opposition parties? I mean, they have to be kind of seizing on this opportunity to attack the BJP, right?
Oh, absolutely. Opposition leaders have been extremely vocal in their condemnation, with figures like Rahul Gandhi calling for a joint parliamentary committee investigation or a JPC investigation into the Adani Group. They're arguing that this scandal is really a symptom of crony capitalism, where powerful businessmen like Adani enjoy undue influence and preferential treatment from the government.
And they're connecting this scandal to that issue of the rising power tariffs, right?
Yeah.
Saying that this alleged bribery scheme has contributed to higher electricity costs for ordinary Indians?
Exactly. They're trying to paint a picture of a government that's more interested in protecting its wealthy allies than in looking out for the interests of the people. And it's a very potent political attack, especially given this widespread concern about the rising cost of living in India.
It sounds like this scandal has become a battleground for this larger political fight about economic inequality and the role of big business in India. It's fascinating how a case that started with allegations of bribery in the renewable energy sector has just spiraled into this much broader debate. But let's step back for a moment and look at the legal side of things. So we know there are arrest warrants out for Gautam Adani and his nephew Sagar Adani in the U.S. What are the chances of them actually facing trial in an American court?
That is a big question mark. Extradition is a very complex process, and India and the U.S. don't actually have an extradition treaty. That specifically covers bribery charges, so it's very likely to be a very long and drawn-out legal battle, with Adani's lawyers doing absolutely everything they can to prevent him from being extradited.
And in the meantime, the SEC is conducting its own investigation into the Adani Group. What are the potential consequences there if they find evidence of wrongdoing?
Well, they could face a range of penalties, including fines, restrictions on their ability to raise capital in U.S. markets, and they could even be barred from doing business with U.S. companies. And that could have a very significant impact on the Adani Group's global operations and ambitions.
So it seems like this case is really just getting started, with potential legal battles on multiple fronts and the political fallout continuing to play out in India. But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about the wider implications of this scandal. What does this mean for the future of renewable energy in India and perhaps even globally? That's a really important question. I mean, we've seen how these allegations have really just rocked the markets and ignited this political firestorm in India. But what about the long-term impact on the renewable energy sector?
I think there's no doubt that this scandal has kind of cast a shadow over India's renewable energy ambitions. Investors are understandably cautious right now, and the Adani Group's troubles could make it more difficult to attract that funding for future projects.
So you're saying this could actually slow down India's transition to cleaner energy sources, and that's kind of concerning, especially given that global push to combat climate change.
Yeah, it's certainly a possibility, but it's not just about the Adani Group. This scandal has raised these broader questions about transparency and accountability in India's renewable energy sector. And if investors perceive a high risk of corruption, they might be less willing to commit capital even to projects that aren't directly connected to Adani.
That makes sense. I mean, no one wants to get caught up in a scandal or risk their investments being tainted by these allegations of wrongdoing. But could there be like a silver lining to all of this? Could this scandal lead to any positive changes in the long run?
It's possible this case has exposed some vulnerabilities in the system, and it's already prompted these calls for greater scrutiny and oversight. So, if the Indian government actually takes some concrete steps to address these issues, strengthening anti-corruption measures, increasing transparency in the bidding process, and holding officials accountable for their actions, it could actually restore investor confidence and create a more stable and attractive environment for renewable energy investments.
So it's almost like a fork in the road.
Yeah.
This scandal could either damage India's renewable energy sector, or if it's handled properly, lead to some much-needed reforms that ultimately strengthen the industry.
Exactly. And it all comes down to how these various stakeholders respond. Not just the Indian government, but also regulatory bodies, international investors, and energy companies themselves.
It's a good reminder that this transition to a sustainable future isn't just about these technological advancements and ambitious targets. It's also about building trust, ensuring transparency, and creating a level playing field where everyone's playing by the rules.
Absolutely. And it really highlights the importance of holding these powerful individuals and corporations accountable for their actions, because corruption can have this really corrosive effect, undermining not just specific projects, but entire industries and even these national goals.
This deep dive has definitely been eye-opening, and it raises so many questions about the future of renewable energy in India and really beyond as we wrap up. Is there anything else you want to leave our listeners with?
I think it's important to just remember that this is a really complex and evolving story. I mean, we're still in the early stages of the legal process, and the full implications of the scandal might not be clear for some time. But what is certain is that this case will have some ripple effects, not just in India, but potentially across the entire global renewable energy landscape. And it's a story worth following closely, not just for its financial and political implications, but for what it reveals about the challenges and opportunities of really trying to build a sustainable future.
Excellent advice. We will definitely be keeping an eye on this story as it unfolds. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive, and we encourage all of you to continue exploring, learning, and engaging with these really complex issues.